It's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother with me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving them attention. I can't. There's good friends of mine out there to say. Well, he's the boss, you have to do his stuff. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the boss is that the boss is your boss.
And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are going to get into part 2 of the Philadelphia mob history, more about Salvatore Sabella today. And next week, we'll move on to part 3 and be talking about John Avena and some other things. So last week, we discussed some of the differences and the reasons as to why the Philadelphia Mafia from day one had a slight issue, forming a powerful group in the early days. However, we do know that eventually Sabella made his way to the top. And one of the bigger problems, if you look closely and historically at Philadelphia, the problem Philly had prior to Sabella, and even to the point during Sabella's run, was having open-minded people working together. And I used the reference to Montedoro, Sicily. And this is one of the reasons as to why. Russell Buffalino, who was so strong because every single person around him came from Montedoro. They were all like-minded people. They had the same beliefs, the same traditions, and it made them tight in bonds. During Sabella's tenure, people during Sabella's tenure would call him fair and a good man. And I think it shows because during Prohibition specifically, as we mentioned last week, there were only 22 murders in Philadelphia. Not all of those could be tied to bootlegging versus some 800 in Chicago in the same time period. And it's not to quantify murder at all or to make murder passable or acceptable, but lower numbers dictates two things. Less men involved, less factional problems, but it also shows that Sabella would rather work with others than take them out. He understood the streets the same way that Luciano did. Money was green, and that was the bottom line. Those 22 murders were relatively uninvestigated because law enforcement in South Philadelphia preferred to leave the underworld issues to the underworld. They turned a blind eye to it. On the front of politics, Sabella was a lot like people before him. Political alliances and payoffs were going on way back before Sabella and the Mafia even arrived. And that goes back to the 1840s. The Irish Catholics fled Ireland because of the famine and arrived in the first row houses built on Moyamensing Township, which is today's Philadelphia. Arson, boat rigging were more a part of the culture, and Sabella was no different in that regard. And he would use payoffs and bribes and collusion like a lot of other people. And they specifically used the Republican Party to facilitate the bottom line. So in those early days of South Philly, South Philly was a fucking slum, and they were much different than those residing, say, in what we know now as Center City. South Philadelphia really had their own rules and their own laws, and they were hardened people. The other issue that helped the Mafia and those like Sabella was the fact that the cops in South Philadelphia had zero control over what was going on. And the same could be said for organized crime, too. Gangs took root like the Irish Catholic killers. They ran the streets before the Civil War, the gumballs, the snakes, and etc. And politicians knew that South Philadelphia was a criminal enclave, and in some ways even cultivated it. South Philly became synonymous with being corrupt and violent. And it's the same way today. Nothing has changed. Narcotics, even in the 1920s, were the main hub of money for Sabella and the Mafia. The intersection between 8th and Christian became a curbside dope market. Evidence would show that the Mafia was somewhat involved, and they saw narcotics as valuable. In 1926, the first National Narcotics Convention was held in Washington, D.C., and South Philadelphia was referenced twice. 8th and Vine and 8th and Christian were known to be Dope Row, where every narcotic could be available for sale, and that showed up in the paperwork, and it was a talking point at the National Narcotics Convention. And so as we move forward, there was still friction with the Zanghi, with Zanghi, okay? As we know, Sabella killed his brother and a couple other guys, and Sabella, had most of that under control. And in those days, mobsters could go to law enforcement and explain the situation and make overtures to the cops that only mob guys are going to be hurt. And in return, the cops will look away. The underworld was the underworld. I promise you, we won't hurt no civilians, but we got to do this. And the cops say, do your thing. Just don't hurt nobody that's not involved. And it was that way back in New York as well. There was an ebb and flow between the mafia and the cops. What was best for all involved is that civilians would not get hurt, like we said, and the only mob guys would kill mob guys. It was an unwritten sort of rule that they worked in tandem to some sort of extent. So in 1928, Philadelphia learned just how expansive the mob's hands went into local law enforcement's pockets. The murders of Huey McLoone and Dan O'Leary took place, and the judge that was overseeing the Scopoletti trials, which dealt with the Zanghi Kokoza murders, began looking into corruption, and the judge would be flanked by District Attorney John Monahan, and they convened a jury to determine how close the city's police force were with gangsters, bootleggers, and etc. And as a result of just that inquiry alone, 100 police officers were fired. One specific cop, a guy by the name of Sam Griffin, had over $500,000 in bank accounts. Other cops had luxury cars, luxury homes. And what Monahan does is he puts their bank records and their bank books on display, and it showed the public how corrupt the police force was in South Philadelphia. It showed direct correlation between the Philadelphia police force and gangsters like Max Hassel, Max Boo Hoff, Mike Duffy, along with other gangsters. And Sabella's name never shows up on that list. So when the Castellamare war drums began to beat, it was Sabella who sided with Salvatore Maranzano. Masseria had Brooklyn and the Lower East Side and Lower Manhattan. And he had the support of the Corleonesi and the Morellos, but Sabella picked a side and he stuck his heels in. In reality, the colostomy bag, the Castellamare war changed the outlook of the mob. Prior, they were a Sicilian faction, but a hybrid organization came out of those events. The two men, Masseria and Maranzano, Masseria was the more passive of the two, whereas Maranzano asserted his power with blood. In other words, murder. So in 1927, the Castellamare began to defend themselves. A war began a few months later, and Salvatore Sabella opens the books. At this initiation ceremony was a 16-year-old Harry Riccobene, who would be officially inducted in the Philadelphia Mafia. Harry Riccobene, being that young in the mob, was not unheard of, but it was a sign of the times. Riccobene's family came from Enna, Sicily, and Harry's father, Mario, was a made guy in the Philadelphia Mafia longer than Sabella had even been a member. Harry was a guy who grew up in the streets, learned by experience, and had a mafia birthright. In 1929, Harry Riccobene takes his first pinch. And rather than use a bribe or a payoff, he goes and does his 6 months. He wasn't going to pay a cop. It wasn't in his DNA. Now, we know he becomes a rat, but in those days, he's like, I'm not even going to give the cops an inch. But in those days, Harry proved that he didn't want to rely on his status within the mafia to help curry any favors. He thought that just created problems. And he didn't depend on the mob guys to bail him out of a problem. But he also spread himself out working with the Lanzettas before the beef began with Sabella. Sabella would end up taking Harry Riccobene to New York to defend the Castellamare and their interests. So Riccobene was a part of those wars. Sabella would, always be careful when he went to New York, often choosing to stay in a safe house, especially during the war. And in May of 1929, to his shock, he hears that Al Capone was in Philadelphia. Capone, who originally was from Brooklyn, had taken off out west with Johnny Torrio, as we know, to take over control of those rackets. And it's worth noting that Capone was paying protection to both Frankie Yale and Joe Masseria. And it's loosely, unusually said that it was a tribute, but it wasn't. It was protection money. So that sort of dispels this myth that Al Capone was some big tough guy. He was paying for protection. Capone was a noted Masseria loyalist, and Sabella worried that about the encroachment. And what Sabella does is he reaches out to friends back in New York on how to handle Al Capone. And scholars believe and have said that Capone had no stomach for war, but wanted Masseria to believe that he was coming to New York to help shoot it out and help fight. But by some happenstance, he gets detained in Philadelphia. And so the optics made it look like Al Capone was going to grab a gun and come shoot it out, but he had no plans of ever going there. Al Capone expected to be treated like a boss that he thought he was. Sabella and others treated him with zero respect, zero regard, like he was a nobody. To them, he was nobody, right? So Capone had floated out feelers about somebody putting him up, like letting him stay at their home, and Sabella and others ignored those requests. And what's interesting about all of this is Capone was a backbiter. He notoriously talked shit about everybody behind their backs. He wasn't loyal to anybody. And while he backed Masseria, it didn't stop him from lambasting Masseria behind his back, claiming that he totally condoned, that he did not condone how Masseria treated the Castellaraces. Nobody else in the underworld would be nice to Capone, and they did that out of respect for Sabella. Now, this is where things are going to get really interesting. And if you guys remember, this was after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and it's been said, and I have even said, that Luciano tells Capone he has to take a pinch in Philadelphia because law enforcement was going after everybody after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and that if he takes a gun pinch, it would be relatively small, and the government would lay off the mafia. However, there's another side that refutes this. And I honestly did not know this until a couple weeks ago when I got all this paperwork. According to what I have, okay, it may actually make a little bit more sense of the situation. It's said that Sabella nor anybody wanted Al Capone there, and a call was made to the police stating that Al Capone was in Philadelphia carrying a gun. Capone would be arrested on May 17th of 1929. So we have two very different stories here. The first one is Luciano told him to go take a pinch. The second one is Sabella didn't want him there and somebody called the cops. So we have two different stories. And I don't know what I don't know which one is the actual story, but I probably believe the Luciano side of things, because to me, it makes more sense considering the climate and what was going on. But who knows? I could be totally wrong. I wasn't there. But Sabella was not, by himself in his thoughts about Al Capone. Capone was Neapolitan by heritage, and he was not a made guy. He was not allowed to be made because he was Neapolitan. Capone would head off to Eastern State Penitentiary, and in reality, he owed a debt to his mob enemies, because if that story about somebody called the cops saved his life legitimately because somebody wanted to kill him, and if that's the case, then he's going to owe the mob forever. And what tends to make me believe that in a kind of way is the fact that Capone, after he gets out, is for some reason allowed to expand through the Sicilian nationwide network of contacts. For a guy who's not Sicilian, they're going to let him, sort of break protocol and stretch his arms a bit. That means that he did them a favor or vice versa. And this is exactly why he paid protection money to them. Because the Sicilians didn't like him, and he's Neapolitan. So the protection money keeps him safe. So in 1929 in Philadelphia, they only had a few Castellarace members. Most of the members during this time were from Western Sicilian areas. However, every single member within Sabella's family were Sicilian on both the maternal and both from paternal sides of their families, mother and father. Most members of the Sabella crime family had no criminal records, which at the time was a little over 20 members. Now, this is going to be an interesting fact, and I don't think any of you know this. Vito Genovese, Joe Valachi, Albert Anastasia, Frank Costello, Al Capone could not be made because they were either from Campania, Naples, Sorrento, or Calabria. It was not until the fall of 1931 that they were officially inducted into organized crime. It was not until Luciano took over the entire mafia that the hybrid version of the mob sort of comes together. It's not until the fall of 31 that non-Sicilians are allowed to be made. Now, do I think that Costello went to a making ceremony? No. Do I think Genovese did? No. Do I think, Genovese might have. Do I think that Al Capone pricked his finger? No. I think that Luciano just said, you guys are made. I think that's the way, because you would think that information would have gotten out at some point historically, that there was a making ceremony for these guys, but they were not recognized as full members of the mafia until the fall of 1931. So when Luciano becomes boss, he was the first leader not from Sicily. He's from Naples. And so the politics of the Sicilian gangsters were different than Luciano, but Luciano would use his street smarts and acumen to bridge the gap between Sicilian mobsters and the Camorra. So with Luciano and under Luciano, the organization would sort of morph and change into something totally different. And Salvatore Sabella, having survived the war, sells all his businesses in South Philadelphia and he moves to Brooklyn. He would align himself with fellow Castellammarese, and he was close to Joe Bonanno, Stefano Magaddino, and Carmine Galante, Gaspard de Gregorio, and others. And near the end of the war, Sabella would be arrested for running over somebody. This is classic. You guys will love this. He runs somebody over. He stops. He puts it in reverse. It backs over them, puts it in drive, and then runs them over again for good measure. And he was arrested for vehicular assault. And when he gives his address, it's actually the home of Stefano Magaddino. Magaddino would end up posting Sabella's bail. He ended up getting a suspended sentence, and on his bail form, he writes down that he's a butcher as his occupation. A month after that, Sabella retires from organized crime, and he was only 40 years old. Maybe the war wore on him a bit. Maybe his last arrest was a result of a fit of rage wore on him. Maybe the change in the mafia or the metamorphosis of the mob had changed his perception of what he was involved in. And when he retires, the mafia had already been in existence for 50 years. And one of the biggest things or the differences that Sabella saw that didn't sit well with him was that the principles had changed. Honor had changed. Avenging a friend and having human justice had degenerated. So perhaps maybe we can say the mafia died right then and there, because it's very clear that after Luciano sort of took over, the dynamics changed, the beliefs changed. So maybe that's when the mob really died. I don't know. Even so, those arrested in 1927 and 31, the arrests that that took place in 27 and 31, they might have worn on him like an old hat. He'd also sort of become a media target and a target of the police. And that might have worn on him. In 1931, Salvatore Maranzano gets whacked in his office. He was stabbed and shot to death, and those that entered the office left hats, and inside of those hats showed that the hats were manufactured in Chicago, which might have been left to throw off law enforcement. What is interesting is a few days prior to that, Al Capone showed up in the office building in Maranzano and asked the elevator operator where Maranzano's office was, but never went upstairs. Conspiracy theory? Maybe so. So, even though Sabella retired, he was still considered a member of the mob. And Sabella had chosen John Avena, who was his closest friend, more like a brother, somebody who had been in the trenches with him to take over the family. And Sabella saw the transition front and center of the Calabrians and those opposite of Sicily now officially being inducted into the mafia, and he didn't agree with it. Meetings had been strictly in the Sicilian dialect for 50 years, but now they were just strictly Italian. Gambling was now becoming the hub of the mafia's core income stream. Narcotics and prostitution were now staples of how the mafia made money, whereas in the old days, prostitution was not allowed. So after the war, Sabella would be in New York, and then he would resettle back in Philadelphia suburbs. He would spread his money around, getting into legitimate enterprises. He ends up getting bumped down in rank and becoming a soldier. During this time, he would finally head to trial for the Zanghi murders. However, Judge Lamberton, who was overseeing that case, had his hands in the pockets of the mob. And on March 7th of 33, all were found not guilty. Then in 1934, Sabella would again move back to New York, but not for long. Sabella had loose ends that he wanted to fix. And while he's back in New York, in Brooklyn specifically, he's walking down the street and he walks past a diner. Inside that diner is Anthony Zanghi, who was for some reason there. And Sabella never forgot how Zanghi ripped him off, snitched on all of them, and then never had the balls to totally leave Philadelphia. Because remember, fucking Sabella gave him money, and he took off with it and still ratted him out. And in 1928, Zanghi, who was no angel himself, ends up killing a guy by the name of Anthony Denny on the same corner that his brother gets hit on so many years earlier. And everybody knew that Zanghi had did it. But somehow he skated, even with witnesses that pointed him out, and that murder today is still unsolved. And by 1935, there were some 5 murder contracts on Zanghi's life, and for good reason. As we said, Sabella spots Zanghi sitting there eating. 45 minutes later, Zanghi pays his bill, walks out front, lit up in a hail of gunfire as he exits, and he's dead on the spot. So in 1933, when Sabella retires, he goes, like I said, into legitimate businesses, and he actually opens up a dress factory and a garment center. But he wasn't making a lot of money. And even though Prohibition was over and Avena had now taken over, Sabella is sort of bored. So he opens a still in Montgomery County, an alcohol still. He actually gets arrested for that. He gets sent to prison for 3 months. And when you look at his prisoner visitor sheet, only his wife and children came to see him. No mob friends, no lawyers, no nothing. And the payoffs that he had used before to stay out of a jam no longer worked for him. So it almost looks like the mob abandoned him. On the outside, Avena has spread his wings and was working together with the Jewish mob and expanded into New Jersey, working with other mob families. He would establish a major bookmaking operation which went from Philly to Jersey to New York and back. And as we know, Avena would be killed, and we're going to talk more in depth about him next week. Sabella actually sees 3 more bosses after Avena. And so as the 1940s came, Sabella would get arrested again for larceny and receiving stolen goods. Months later, the charges would not be prosecuted, and Sabella would walk. And Sabella at this point is no longer wealthy. Bad investments, no longer having a legal income, had crippled him. And Sabella's one criticism was that he didn't diversify his money, whereas others around him had. And the tone had also changed in South Philadelphia. A few times when Sabella went into Little Italy, vendors in the community would be outraged and call the police on him. Gone were the days where Sabella was respected and honored. And Sabella, likely needing money badly, actually tried to half extort new business owners in South Philadelphia. And Joe Bruno, who was the new boss at that time, had to step in and pay the store owners not to call the cops. And Sabella just started getting more and more attention from law enforcement. It seems like, looking at his story, Sabella was on top of shit when he was the boss. The minute he's no longer the boss, he starts to get sloppy. And the last legal notice that we find about Sabella is in 1954, when INS was looking to deport him because he had lied about a conviction as a juvenile. However, because he was in ill health and he had children that were born in this country, they let it go. He had gone back to butchering and could be found at his butcher shop in South Philadelphia. Maybe he knew something nobody else knew, but the timing of his retirement was actually a pretty shrewd move, because shortly after that, the Kafoffer hearings would begin. And it was the early formation of eradicating the mafia, and Sabella escaped every single minute of that. It was never brought up. In fact, when you actually look at those Senate meetings, Philadelphia really wasn't even mentioned or harmed in any of those things anyway. And they're really the only crime family that was left out of that whole entire thing. And I think that Sabella walked away when he felt it was time. And he didn't have the desire to keep pushing. And the gossip of South Philadelphia, had its damaging effects too. Residents often called Sabella weak, complained that he cheated on his wife, and that he was an embarrassment to the streets. And somehow Philadelphia has never changed. They're exactly like that now. Sabella would be the last Sicilian-born, recognized boss of the Philadelphia Mafia, other than John Stanfa. But he was not, that's a whole other thing we talked about earlier today. But to Sabella, The most important thing was his sons never entered the life. And Sabella had remarked that it was against the rules in Cosa Nostra for any Sicilian mobster to allow their sons to even get involved in that life. But that rule had come and gone out the window. And Sabella might not be the wealthy man that many of his contemporaries were, but his sons, his daughters were all successful, law-abiding citizens. And that's all Sabella ever wanted. He didn't care if he was poor, as long as his children were okay. That's what was important. He had achieved the American dream. As we know, Sabella was a lifelong smoker, 6 packs of cigarettes a day, and he begins to have serious problems with his heart and his lungs. Likely emphysema, cancer, and other issues began to wear on him, and he enters the hospital in 1962 and ends up dying. And of all of the friends that he had in that life, the only member or the only representative of the mafia who came to pay any respects to him was Angelo Bruno, who had gone from a hitman to the boss of the Philadelphia Mafia. And so that's the story of Salvatore Sabella. It's an interesting character arc, to say the least. And so when we come back next week, we're going to be discussing John Avena and some other people. And I hope you all come back and join us, because we're going to get very in-depth. And I hope that, listen, I don't think anybody, and I'm not just being egotistical about it, I've looked around, I haven't really seen a lot of people talk about Sabella in this kind of way. But it's interesting to draw the parallels because, like I say all the time on this show, good, bad, and indifferent, South Philadelphia has never been functional in terms of the streets. They've had periods of time, like under Joe Agambi, where they were successful. Angelo Bruno, they were relatively successful until the end. But everything that after that has been a fucking mess. And yes, there is some truth to Joey Merlino keeping everything on the even keel for the last 10 years, but think about those 7 years where they were all warring. And I've always said that when John Stanfa came to South Philadelphia, one of the biggest issues was he was Sicilian. He believed in core values from Sicily. And he has guys in his Borgata who are 5, 6, 7 generations removed from Sicily. And the majority of them are not even Sicilian. They're fucking Neapolitan, Calabrian. There's more Calabrians in South Philly than there are Sicilians. And there is a big difference. And it's just interesting to show Sabella's rise and how everything after him was never really complete. Bruno, yeah, he had a great run, but he had a lot of problems too. Because the reason why Bruno, I think, worked so well for South Philly was because of his protection from Gambino and Buffalino and other people. His friendship is what kept everything relatively calm. And I agree that Bruno was a sophisticated guy. He was a smart guy. He did not believe in violence being the answer. And that went against the whole entire historical version of South Philadelphia. But look at what happens. Look at how Bruno goes. Violence. Testa, violence. Nicky Scarfo, violence. John Stanfa, violence. Joey Merlino, violence. Sabella, violence. The one guy who had a relatively quiet, good run was the guy who didn't fire a gun. There's a lot to say about that. Do I think it's a little too passive? Absolutely. But you can't bring a guy in from Sicily who hasn't come up the fucking rank and file, and he wants to run it like you're living in the fucking farm fields in Corleone. It doesn't work like that. That was what Stanfa's problem was. So it's a very interesting sort of look at South Philadelphia. It's never really changed. But every 25 years, if you look at the historic history of all of this, if you look at the entire history of Philadelphia, from Sabella to Avena to Bruno, Bruno comes along 25, 30 years later, right? Things start to work themselves out. Philadelphia is ripe for a change. They are ripe for a change, and I believe change is coming. I'm telling you. Mark my fucking words. Anyway, come back next week for part 3. We're going to talk about John Avena. We'll do another Armchair Mob quarterbacking session, another Q&A, and whatever else we find interesting in between now and then. Have a great weekend, everybody. And I hope you enjoyed the show. Please feel free to reach out to mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com and let me know what you think. All that being said, we're going to get out of here. Hope you enjoy it. We'll see all of you soon.